I never believed in miracles until a tiny, broken kitten chose me as her savior on the coldest night of my life. My name is Sarah, and 18 months ago, I was living on the streets of Portland, Oregon, with nothing but a torn sleeping bag and the weight of shame pressing down on my chest like a concrete slab. I thought I had lost everything that mattered. I thought I was invisible to the world. But sometimes, when you're at your lowest point, when you feel like you've disappeared completely, something small and fragile finds you and reminds you that you still matter. It was 2:47 in the morning when I first heard her crying, a desperate, heart-wrenching sound that cut through the November wind like a knife through silence. I was huddled behind a dumpster outside Murphy's Diner on 5th Street, trying to shield myself from the rain that had been falling for 3 straight days. My clothes were soaked through, my fingers were numb, and I hadn't eaten anything substantial in over 48 hours. But that cry, that tiny, helpless wail, it pierced right through my own misery and grabbed hold of something deep inside my chest. Speech balloon, I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? The sound was coming from somewhere near the garbage bins, and at first, I thought it might be a baby. My heart started racing as I forced myself to stand up on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. The rain was coming down harder now, creating small rivers that flowed between the cracked pavement stones. Each step I took sent sharp pains shooting up through my worn-out sneakers. But I had to find where that crying was coming from. When I rounded the corner of the dumpster, I saw her. A tiny orange and white kitten, no bigger than my cupped hands, was trying to crawl out from underneath a pile of soggy cardboard boxes. She was drenched to the bone, her fur matted against her tiny body, making her look even smaller than she already was. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes. They were bright green and filled with such pain and fear that I felt my own heart break into 1,000 pieces. She looked up at me with those enormous eyes, and I swear she was asking me for help. Not just asking, begging. Her little mouth opened, and another one of those desperate cries escaped, but this time it was weaker, like she was running out of strength to call for help. I realized in that moment that we were both fighting the same battle. We were both alone, both forgotten, both trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to break us down. I've been homeless for 8 months now. It started when I lost my job at the accounting firm where I'd worked for 6 years. The company downsized, and I was part of the group they let go. I thought I'd find something else quickly. I had experience, good references, a college degree. But weeks turned into months, and my savings disappeared faster than water through a broken dam. First went my apartment, then my car, then my dignity. I tried staying with friends at first, but there's only so long you can sleep on someone's couch before you start to feel like a burden. My family lived 3 states away, and I was too proud to call them and admit that I'd failed so completely. So I ended up here on the streets, learning how to become invisible, how to find shelter in doorways and under bridges, how to stretch a single meal into an entire day's worth of energy. The nights were the hardest part, not just because of the cold or the fear, but because of the silence, the crushing, overwhelming silence that comes when you realize no one in the world knows where you are or whether you're alive or dead. I'd lie awake staring at the stars through whatever makeshift shelter I'd managed to create, wondering if this was how my story was going to end. Alone, forgotten, meaningless. But here was this kitten, this tiny creature who was even more helpless than I was, looking at me like I might be her salvation. Like I might be someone who mattered after all. I crouched down slowly, not wanting to scare her, and extended my hand toward her tiny, shivering form. She flinched at first, pressing herself deeper into the cardboard, but then something changed in her eyes. Maybe she recognized something in me. The same desperation, the same need for connection, the same will to survive despite everything. "Come here, little one," I whispered, my voice hoarse from days of not speaking to anyone. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." She took one tentative step toward me, then another. Her tiny paws were making barely audible splashing sounds in the puddles that had formed around the dumpster. When she was close enough, I gently scooped her up in my hands, and I could feel her tiny heart beating so fast it felt like it might burst right out of her chest. She was so cold. Her little body was trembling uncontrollably, and I could feel her ribs through her wet fur. I pressed her against my chest, trying to share what little body heat I had left, and she immediately curled up against me, pressing her tiny face into the hollow of my throat. For the first time in months, I felt needed. For the first time since I'd lost everything, someone, even if it was just a kitten, was depending on me. I looked around frantically, trying to figure out what to do next. The rain was getting heavier, and my usual sleeping spot behind the dumpster wasn't going to provide enough shelter for both of us. I needed to find somewhere dry, somewhere warm, somewhere safe. But where? Every doorway, every overhang, every potential shelter in this part of town was either locked up tight or already claimed by someone else. That's when I remembered the old abandoned warehouse about 6 blocks away. I'd walked past it dozens of times, but never considered it as a place to sleep because it was so far from the areas where people sometimes dropped off food or spare change. But tonight, distance didn't matter. What mattered was keeping this tiny life warm and safe. I tucked the kitten inside my jacket, zipping it up carefully so she was completely enclosed against my chest. I could feel her tiny claws gripping onto my shirt as I started walking, her little body still trembling, but gradually beginning to warm up from my body heat. With each step, I felt a purpose I hadn't experienced in months. I wasn't just wandering aimlessly anymore. I had somewhere to go, someone to protect, a reason to keep moving forward. The warehouse was further than I remembered, and by the time I reached it, I was exhausted and soaked to the bone. But I'd found a broken window on the ground floor that I could climb through, and once inside, I discovered that the upper floors were relatively dry. There were old tarps and pieces of canvas scattered around, probably left behind by construction workers years ago. I made a nest in the corner using the driest materials I could find, creating a small shelter that would protect us both from the wind and rain. The kitten, I was already starting to think of her as mine, stayed pressed against my chest the entire time, occasionally letting out tiny mews that sounded more like sighs than cries. Once our makeshift shelter was complete, I sat down carefully and unzipped my jacket. She looked up at me with those incredible green eyes, and I swear I saw gratitude there. Not just relief, but actual gratitude. Like she understood that I had chosen to help her when I could have just walked away. "I'm going to call you Hope," I told her, gently stroking her tiny head with one finger. "Because that's what you are. You're my hope." She purred. It was the smallest, quietest purr I'd ever heard. But it was there. This tiny creature, who had been abandoned and left to die in the rain, was purring because someone had finally shown her kindness. The sound filled up all the empty spaces in my chest, all the hollow places that had been echoing with loneliness for months. But even as I held her close and felt her tiny body finally relaxing into sleep, I knew our real challenges were just beginning. I had no money for food, no way to get her to a veterinarian, no permanent shelter to offer her. I was barely surviving myself. How was I supposed to take care of a kitten who needed so much more than I could possibly provide? That first night with Hope changed something fundamental inside me. For the first time in months, I wasn't just thinking about my own survival. I had someone else to consider, someone who was depending on me completely. It was terrifying and overwhelming, but it was also the first time I'd felt truly alive since losing my job and my home. The next morning brought new concerns that I hadn't even considered the night before. Hope was hungry, desperately hungry, and she was looking at me with those trusting eyes like I had all the answers. I checked my pockets and found exactly 73 cents. Not enough for kitten food, not enough for milk, not enough for anything that might keep a tiny kitten alive. I made the decision to take her with me as I made my usual rounds, hoping to find enough change or maybe some food that we could share. I fashioned a small sling out of an old t-shirt, creating a pouch where she could ride close to my chest while keeping my hands free. She seemed to understand that we were in this together now, staying quiet and still as we walked through the downtown area. Our first stop was outside the coffee shop, where I sometimes found day-old pastries in the dumpster. The owner, Mrs. Chun, had caught me digging through her garbage a few weeks earlier, but instead of calling the police, she'd started leaving clean boxes of leftover baked goods on top of the dumpster instead of throwing them away. I'd never spoken to her directly. I was too embarrassed, too ashamed of what I'd become. But her small act of kindness had kept me alive more than once. This morning, there was a box waiting as usual, but when I opened it, I found something unexpected. Along with the usual assortment of muffins and croissants, there was a small container of milk and a note that simply said, "For your friend." I looked up at the coffee shop window and saw Mrs. Chun watching me through the glass. She smiled and gave me a small wave before turning back to her customers. Somehow, she had seen hope yesterday, or maybe she'd just noticed that I wasn't alone anymore. Either way, her kindness made my eyes fill with tears that I quickly wiped away before anyone else could see them. Hope drank the milk eagerly, and I soaked small pieces of muffin in the remaining milk to make them soft enough for her to eat. Watching her eat with such enthusiasm, seeing her tiny pink tongue lapping at the milk, gave me more joy than I'd felt in months. For the first time since I'd lost everything, I felt like I was good at something again. I was good at taking care of her. But our challenges were far from over. As the days passed, I realized that having Hope with me changed everything about life on the streets. I couldn't take her to some of the places where I used to find shelter because they were too dangerous for a small animal. I couldn't leave her alone while I went looking for food or work because I was terrified that something would happen to her. And I couldn't ignore the fact that she needed medical attention that I simply couldn't afford. She had developed a small cough that worried me constantly. It was probably just from being out in the cold and rain. But what if it was something more serious? What if she had an infection that would get worse without proper treatment? The thought of losing her, of failing to keep her safe after she had trusted me with her life, was more terrifying than anything I'd faced since becoming homeless. During our second week together, Hope and I had settled into a routine that revolved entirely around keeping her safe and healthy. We would wake up in our warehouse shelter before dawn, and I would check her breathing, her temperature, her appetite. I had become hypervigilant about any changes in her behavior, any signs that she might be getting sicker. The weather was getting colder, and I knew that staying in the warehouse much longer wasn't sustainable. We needed heat, proper food, and most importantly, we needed medical care for Hope's persistent cough. I had started timing our daily walks to coincide with the lunch rush downtown, hoping to collect enough spare change to eventually afford a trip to a veterinarian. It was during one of these walks that everything changed. Hope and I were sitting outside the public library, where I sometimes went to warm up and use the bathroom. I was trying to give her some water from a small bottle I'd managed to find when a woman approached us. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed but not flashy, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She knelt down next to us without saying a word and simply watched as I helped Hope drink from the bottle cap I was using as a bowl. "She's beautiful," the woman finally said, her voice gentle and non-threatening. "How long have you two been together?" "About 2 weeks," I replied, instinctively pulling Hope closer to my chest. "I found her behind Murphy's diner." She was in pretty bad shape." The woman nodded thoughtfully, and I noticed she was studying Hope with the practiced eye of someone who knew animals well. My name is Dr. Martinez. I'm a veterinarian, and I run a clinic about 10 blocks from here. That cough sounds like it might need some attention. I felt my heart sink. I knew Hope needed medical care, but I also knew I couldn't afford it. I don't have any money, I admitted, the shame burning in my cheeks. I've been trying to take care of her, but I know she needs more than I can give her. Dr. Martinez smiled, but it wasn't the pitying smile I'd grown accustomed to from people who looked at me and saw only my failures. It was a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes and made me feel like I was still a human being worth talking to. What if we worked something out? She asked. I could examine your kitten and treat whatever needs treating. In exchange, maybe you could help out around the clinic. We always need extra hands for cleaning, organizing supplies, that sort of thing. I stared at her in disbelief. Are you serious? Completely serious. I can see how much you love her, and she obviously trusts you completely. That kind of bond is rare, and it's worth protecting. That afternoon, I found myself walking through the doors of the East Side Animal Clinic with Hope tucked safely in her makeshift sling. The clinic was warm and bright and smelled like disinfectant and hope. Dr. Martinez introduced me to her staff. 2 technicians named Maria and James, and a receptionist named Linda. Simply as Sarah, Hope's mom. Not Sarah the homeless woman. Not Sarah who obviously hadn't showered in days and was wearing clothes that had seen better weeks. Just Sarah, a woman who loved her kitten. The examination revealed that Hope had a minor respiratory infection that could be easily treated with antibiotics. She was also underweight and had some minor skin irritation from being wet for so long. But overall, Dr. Martinez said, she was a remarkably healthy kitten considering what she'd been through. You've done an excellent job taking care of her, Dr. Martinez told me as she prepared Hope's medication. She's lucky to have you. Those words hit me harder than I expected. For months, every interaction I'd had with other people had reinforced the message that I was a failure, that I couldn't take care of myself, let alone anyone else. But here was a professional, someone whose opinion mattered, telling me that I'd done something right, that I'd succeeded at something important. I started working at the clinic the next day. My job was simple: cleaning kennels, organizing supplies, feeding the animals that were staying overnight, helping with basic tasks that freed up the trained staff to focus on medical care. But being there, being useful, being part of something that helped animals like Hope, gave me a sense of purpose I'd almost forgotten existed. The other staff members treated me with kindness and respect. They didn't ask intrusive questions about my living situation or make me feel like a charity case. They simply accepted that I was there to work and to help, and they appreciated the care and attention I brought to every task. Hope became the clinic mascot almost immediately. She would sleep in a small bed that Linda had bought for her, positioned in the main office where she could watch everything that was happening. During the day, she would greet customers with quiet confidence, allowing children to pet her soft fur while their own animals received treatment. She seemed to understand her role perfectly, purring and playing just enough to make everyone smile without becoming a distraction. But the most amazing thing was watching Hope's transformation over those first few weeks at the clinic. Within days of starting her antibiotics, her cough disappeared completely. Her fur grew thick and glossy, her eyes bright and alert. She gained weight rapidly and grew noticeably larger, developing the confident, playful personality that had been hidden under layers of fear and survival instinct. Watching her become the kitten she was always meant to be gave me hope for my own transformation. If she could overcome everything she'd been through, if she could learn to trust again, to play again, to be happy again, then maybe I could too. Dr. Martinez noticed the change in both of us. After I'd been working at the clinic for about a month, she asked me to stay after closing time one evening. "Sarah," she said, settling into her office chair while Hope curled up in her lap. "I have a proposition for you." I felt my stomach clench with worry. Was she going to let me go? Had I done something wrong? "I've been thinking about expanding the clinic services," she continued. "I'd like to offer a program for people who can't afford veterinary care for their pets. Mobile clinics, reduced-cost spay and neuter services, that sort of thing. I need someone to help coordinate the program. Someone who understands what it's like to love an animal when you don't have the resources to provide everything they need." She was offering me a real job. Not just cleaning kennels and organizing supplies, but a position with responsibility, with purpose, with a chance to help other people like me who love their animals but couldn't afford proper care. "I'd also like to help you find a more permanent housing situation," she added. "I know someone who rents small apartments specifically to people who are getting back on their feet. The rent is affordable, and pets are welcome." I looked down at Hope, who was purring contentedly in Dr. Martinez's lap, completely comfortable and secure. 6 weeks earlier, she had been dying in the rain behind a dumpster. Now she was healthy and happy and surrounded by people who cared about her. If she could make such an incredible journey, maybe I could too. 3 months later, Hope and I moved into our own apartment. It was small, just a studio with a tiny kitchen and bathroom, but it was ours. We had a real bed to sleep in, a window that looked out onto a small garden, and most importantly, we had each other. The work coordinating the mobile veterinary program was more fulfilling than any job I'd ever had. Every day, I helped reunite lost animals with their families, provided medical care to pets whose owners were struggling financially, and offered support to people who were facing some of the same challenges I'd overcome. I understood their shame, their fear, their desperate love for animals who depended on them completely. But the program grew beyond anything Dr. Martinez or I had initially envisioned. Word spread quickly through Portland's homeless community about the services we were providing, and soon we were seeing not just people who couldn't afford veterinary care, but individuals who were living on the streets with their animals and needed comprehensive support. Hope continued to be my constant companion and an integral part of everything we were building. She came to work with me every day, and she seemed to understand that her job was to provide comfort to scared animals and anxious owners. I watched her approach frightened cats with infinite patience, showing them through her own calm confidence that the clinic was a safe place. She would curl up next to dogs who were recovering from surgery, offering her warmth and presence during their healing process. It was during our 6th month in the apartment that I met Marcus and his dog Lucky, a meeting that would fundamentally change the trajectory of our program and prove to me that Hope's influence extended far beyond what I'd ever imagined. I was walking Hope through the neighborhood park on a Sunday afternoon when we encountered a scene that brought back powerful memories of that first night when I'd found her. A young homeless man was sitting on a bench, holding a small dog who was clearly sick and in pain. The man was crying, not just tears, but the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from absolute desperation. I recognized that cry because I'd cried it myself, alone in the dark, when I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. I approached him carefully, the same way Dr. Martinez had approached me months earlier. I sat down on the bench beside him and waited for him to notice me. "She's been sick for 3 days, he finally said without looking up. "I don't know what to do. I can't afford to take her to a vet, but I can't just let her suffer. She's all I have left." His name was Marcus, and he'd been living on the streets for over a year after aging out of the foster care system. Lucky, a small terrier mix, had been his companion for most of that time, and they were inseparable. But Lucky had developed what appeared to be a serious infection, and Marcus was facing the impossible choice between watching his best friend suffer or using what little money he had for medical care instead of food. I told him about Dr. Martinez and the mobile program, about how we'd helped dozens of people in similar situations. I told him about Hope and our journey from that night behind the dumpster to where we were now. I watched his face change as he began to understand that there might be hope for him and Lucky too. The next morning, I brought Marcus and Lucky to the clinic. Dr. Martinez examined Lucky and discovered that she had a treatable urinary tract infection that had been made worse by poor nutrition and stress. Within a few days of starting treatment, Lucky was feeling better, and Marcus had started helping out at the clinic just like I had. But Marcus brought something to our program that I hadn't anticipated. He had connections throughout the homeless community that I'd never been able to establish. Within weeks of his arrival, word had spread through networks I didn't even know existed, and we started seeing people from all over the city who needed help caring for their animals. There was Elena, a woman in her 60s who'd been living in her car with 3 cats after losing her apartment when her husband died. There was David, a veteran with PTSD whose service dog had been his only anchor to reality since returning from deployment, but who couldn't afford the animal's specialized medical needs. There was Maria, a teenager who'd been kicked out of her home for being gay, and was living under a bridge with a puppy she'd found abandoned in a parking lot. Each person who came to us was carrying the same weight I'd carried for so long. The shame of needing help, the fear of judgment, the desperate love for an animal who depended on them completely. And each time I looked into their eyes, I saw myself on that first night when I'd found hope behind the dumpster. But something remarkable started happening as our program grew, and word spread beyond the homeless community. Local news outlets began covering our work, and suddenly people throughout Portland were learning about the deep bonds between homeless individuals and their animals. They were hearing stories that challenged every stereotype they'd ever held about homelessness and what it meant to be a responsible pet owner. The community response was overwhelming in the best possible way. Donations started pouring in, not just money, but supplies, volunteer time, and most importantly, genuine care and respect for the people we were serving. Local veterinarians offered their services at reduced rates. Pet supply stores began donating food and medical supplies regularly. Families started bringing their children to volunteer at our mobile clinics, teaching them about compassion and the importance of helping others regardless of their circumstances. But the most incredible part was watching how Hope herself had become the heart of our entire operation. She seemed to understand that she had an important role to play in helping other animals and their people. During our mobile clinic visits, she would approach scared animals with the same patience and gentleness that someone had once shown to her. She became a therapy animal without any formal training, simply because she remembered what it felt like to be scared and abandoned, and she wanted to help others feel safe. I'll never forget the day we met Thomas and his dog Bear, a meeting that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. Thomas was probably in his 70s, with a long gray beard and eyes that had seen too much sadness. He'd been homeless for over a year after losing his disability benefits due to a bureaucratic error, and he'd been living with Bear, a large German Shepherd mix, who was clearly his entire world. But Bear was limping badly and obviously in pain. When Dr. Martinez examined him during one of our mobile clinic visits, she discovered that he had a serious infection in his front paw that had been causing him excruciating pain for weeks. The infection was treatable, but Bear needed surgery and several weeks of follow-up care. Thomas broke down crying when Dr. Martinez explained what needed to be done, convinced that he was going to lose the only family he had left. "I can't pay for surgery," he said through his tears. "I've already failed him so badly. Maybe you should just put him to sleep so he won't have to suffer anymore." That's when Hope did something I'd never seen her do before. She walked directly over to Thomas and climbed into his lap, purring loudly and pressing her face against his chest. Bear, despite his pain, managed to lift his head and look at Hope with what I swear was recognition. One rescued animal acknowledging another. "We're not putting anyone to sleep," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "We're going to take care of Bear, and we're going to make sure he gets everything he needs to be healthy again. The surgery was successful, but Bear's recovery required Thomas to stay in one place for several weeks. That's when the community we'd been building truly showed its strength. Mrs. Chun from the coffee shop, who had become one of our most dedicated supporters, helped coordinate temporary housing for Thomas and Bear. Local hotels offered free rooms during the recovery period. Restaurants donated meals. A local legal aid clinic helped Thomas navigate the paperwork to restore his disability benefits. But the most touching part was watching the relationship that developed between Hope and Bear during those weeks of recovery. Every day when we visited to check on Bear's healing, Hope would curl up next to the much larger dog, sharing her warmth and somehow communicating that everything was going to be okay. Bear, who had been wary of strangers and other animals due to his life on the streets, completely relaxed in Hope's presence. It was during one of those visits that a local news reporter, Jessica Thompson, asked if she could do a feature story about our program. I was hesitant at first. I'd spent so long being invisible that the thought of being on television terrified me. But Dr. Martinez convinced me that sharing our story might help other communities start similar programs. The day of the interview, Jessica brought her camera crew to the clinic and asked me to tell our story from the beginning. As I talked about finding Hope behind the dumpster, about those first desperate weeks when we were both just trying to survive, about how Dr. Martinez's kindness had changed everything, I watched Jessica's eyes fill with tears. But the moment that really captured everyone's hearts was when Jessica asked me to explain why this work was so important to me. I was trying to find the right words when Hope, who had been sleeping in her bed in the corner, suddenly got up and walked over to where Thomas was sitting with Bear. She climbed into Thomas's lap and began purring, while Bear gently rested his massive head on her tiny back. "That's why," I said, pointing to the three of them, "because everyone deserves to be loved like that. Everyone deserves to have someone who chooses them, who sees past their circumstances to the love they have to offer." The segment aired on a Friday evening during the local news, and by Monday morning, our phones were ringing constantly. The story had been picked up by national news networks, and suddenly people from all over the country were contacting us, wanting to know how they could start similar programs in their own communities. But the most overwhelming response came from right here in Portland. The Monday after the story aired, I arrived at the clinic to find a line of people stretching around the block. They weren't all homeless people seeking help. Many of them were community members who wanted to volunteer, to donate, to be part of what we were building. Mrs. Chun had to temporarily close her coffee shop that day because so many people wanted to help that she couldn't handle both the volunteers and her regular customers. Dr. Martinez had to bring in additional staff just to coordinate all the donations that were pouring in. And Hope, bless her heart, spent the entire day going from person to person, accepting pets and treats, and somehow managing to make everyone feel welcome and appreciated. That's when I realized that our story had become about something much bigger than one homeless woman and one abandoned kitten. It had become a symbol of what's possible when a community decides to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances. The weeks following the news story brought changes I never could have anticipated. The City Council voted to allocate funding for permanent support services for homeless individuals with pets. Local apartment complexes began changing their policies to accept tenants with animals. Schools started inviting us to speak to students about compassion and the importance of helping others. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how people in our communities started treating homeless individuals and their animals. Instead of looking away or crossing the street, people began to see the love between these individuals and their pets. They began to understand that having an animal didn't make someone's homelessness less valid or more difficult to address. It made their humanity more visible. I remember one particular day about 3 months after the news story aired. Hope and I were walking through downtown when we passed a young man sitting outside a bookstore with a small cat in his lap. A year earlier, people would have walked past him without making eye contact. But this day, I watched person after person stop to ask about his cat, to offer food or supplies, to treat him like a human being worthy of conversation and respect. The young man looked at me as we approached, and I could see the surprise and gratitude in his eyes. He wasn't used to being treated with such kindness by strangers. "This is amazing," he said, gesturing to the small pile of cat food and supplies that people had given him throughout the day. "I've never experienced anything like this. People are actually seeing me, actually caring about me and my cat. That's the power of love," I told him, thinking about Hope and how she had changed everything for me. When people see how much you love your cat, they remember their own capacity for love. They remember what it means to care about something more than yourself. As the 1-year anniversary of the news story approached, Jessica Thompson contacted us about doing a follow-up piece. She wanted to see how our program had evolved and to highlight some of the success stories that had emerged from our work. But the night before the follow-up story was scheduled to air, something happened that would test everything we'd built and remind me why this work was so important. I received a call at 5:30 in the morning from Dr. Martinez. There had been a fire at one of the temporary housing facilities where several of our program participants were staying. Everyone had gotten out safely, but many people had lost everything they owned, and several animals had been injured by smoke inhalation. Hope and I rushed to the scene to find chaos and heartbreak. 23 people and their animals were standing in the parking lot of a Red Cross emergency shelter, watching everything they'd managed to rebuild go up in flames. The look in their eyes was all too familiar. That hollow, desperate expression of people who'd lost everything and didn't know how they were going to survive. But then something beautiful began to happen. Word of the fire spread through the community we'd built over the past year, and people started showing up. Mrs. Chun arrived with coffee and breakfast for everyone affected. Dr. Martinez set up a triage station in the parking lot to treat the animals who'd been affected by smoke. Local hotels began offering free rooms. Families started arriving with clothes, toiletries, and pet supplies. Marcus, who was now working full-time coordinating our mobile clinics, had organized a network of volunteers who could respond to exactly this kind of emergency. Thomas, fully housed now and with Bear completely recovered, arrived with a truck full of donated supplies that he'd been collecting for months. Elena, who had found permanent housing for herself and her 3 cats, came with homemade food for both people and animals. By noon, every person and animal who'd been displaced by the fire had somewhere safe to stay, and everything they needed for immediate survival. But more than that, they had a community that refused to let them face this crisis alone. I was standing in the parking lot, watching this incredible outpouring of support, when Hope did something that brought tears to my eyes. She walked over to a small girl who was crying and holding an injured rabbit, and she gently rubbed against the child's legs until the little girl picked her up. Hope began purring, and I watched the child's tears slowly stop as she focused on comforting this little cat who had once needed comfort herself. That's when I truly understood what we created. Our program wasn't just about providing veterinary care or temporary housing. It was about building a community where everyone's pain mattered, where everyone's love was valued, where no one had to face their darkest moments alone. The follow-up news story that aired the next day captured all of this. Jessica's cameras had been there for the fire and its aftermath, and they documented not just the tragedy, but the incredible community response that followed. The story showed Thomas and Bear, both healthy and housed now, volunteering to help other fire victims. It showed Mrs. Chun coordinating donations while serving free meals. It showed Dr. Martinez treating injured animals while tears streamed down her face. But the moment that made the entire town cry, the moment that became the emotional climax of our story, came when Jessica interviewed the little girl who'd been holding the injured rabbit. The child, whose name was Emma, talked about how scared she'd been when she thought she might lose her pet, and how Hope had helped her feel less afraid. The nice kitty knew what it felt like to be scared, Emma said in her small, serious voice. She showed me that even when bad things happen, there are always people who will help. She showed me that love is stronger than being scared. The camera then panned to show Hope, who was sitting quietly nearby, watching over Emma and her rabbit with the same gentle protectiveness she'd shown me on that first night behind the dumpster. In that moment, everyone watching could see the full circle of our story. How one small act of rescue had rippled outward to touch an entire community. How choosing to save one tiny life had somehow made everyone's life a little bit more precious. The response to that follow-up story was unlike anything we'd experienced before. Donations poured in from across the country. Other cities began implementing their own versions of our program. The President's office reached out about featuring our work as a model for community-based solutions to homelessness. But for me, the most meaningful response came from right here in Portland. In the weeks following the story, I started noticing something different about our city. People were making eye contact with homeless individuals instead of looking away. Families were teaching their children about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Business owners were finding ways to support homeless community members instead of trying to make them invisible. Hope had somehow become a symbol of what's possible when we choose compassion over judgment. When we choose to see the love in everyone instead of focusing on their circumstances. Her story reminded people that we're all just looking for someone to choose us, someone to see past our brokenness to the love we have to offer. Today, 18 months after I found Hope behind that dumpster, our program has helped over 1,000 people and their animals. We've expanded to include mental health services, job training programs, and permanent housing assistance. We've helped reunite families, heal trauma, and rebuild lives. The Hope Project, as it's now officially known, operates out of 3 locations across Portland, with plans to expand to other cities throughout Oregon. We have a full-time staff of 12 people, most of whom have experienced homelessness themselves and understand the unique challenges faced by people living on the streets with animals. But every evening, when Hope and I go home to our apartment, we've moved to a larger place now, with 2 bedrooms and a real kitchen. I'm reminded that the most important transformation happened in those first few moments when a tiny, dying kitten looked at me and decided I was worth trusting. Everything else, the clinic work, the community programs, the national recognition, all of it grew from that single moment of connection between 2 desperate souls who chose to save each other. Hope is older now, more dignified and wise, but she still purrs against my chest every night before we fall asleep. She still greets every new person and animal who comes to our clinics with the same patient kindness that someone once showed to her. She still seems to understand that her job is to remind everyone she meets that they are worthy of love, regardless of their circumstances. Sometimes, when I watch her comforting a scared animal or bringing joy to a heartbroken person, I think about all the lives that might never have been touched if I'd walked away that night. All the people who might still be suffering alone if one small kitten hadn't trusted me with her life. All the love that might never have been shared if we hadn't found each other in that dark alley behind Murphy's Diner. The truth is, I didn't save Hope that night in the rain. She saved me. She saved me from disappearing completely, from giving up on the possibility that my life could matter to someone. She showed me that love always finds a way to multiply itself, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can change everything. But more than that, she taught an entire community that we're all connected, that everyone's pain matters, and that the love between a person and their animal is one of the purest, most powerful forces in the world. She taught us that home isn't a place, It's the feeling of being chosen, of being important to someone else's survival and happiness. Most importantly, Hope taught us that miracles don't always come in the form we expect. Sometimes they're tiny and orange and white, with green eyes that can see straight into your soul. Sometimes they find us in the darkest places, when we think we've lost everything that matters. And sometimes, if we're very brave and very lucky, we choose to save them right back. As I write this, Hope is curled up in her favorite spot by the window, watching the rain fall on the garden outside our apartment. She's warm and safe and loved, just like she was always meant to be. Just like we're all meant to be. And somewhere out there, in another alley behind another diner, another desperate soul is finding another tiny miracle that will change everything. Because that's what love does. It ripples outward, touches more lives than we can imagine, and reminds us all that no one has to face their darkest moments alone. The Hope Project continues to grow, touching more lives every day, because Hope taught us the most important lesson of all, that choosing to love someone, even when you have nothing left to give, is the most powerful force in the universe. It's the force that saves us all, one small act of kindness at a time, one broken heart healed through the love of another. One tiny kitten who reminds an entire community that we all deserve to be chosen, to be loved, to be seen as worthy of rescue. This is Hope's story. This is our story. This is the story of how love multiplies, how kindness spreads, and how sometimes the smallest among us carry the biggest miracles in their hearts.